In this video, we're going to discuss the ethics of research. In psychology, the American Psychological Association has ethical principles. These principles must be upheld for any experiment or any sort of clinical trial. These codes of ethics lay out standards for psychologists and identify behaviors that deserve punishment. In other words, if a psychologist goes against an ethical recommendation, they can be punished. The code includes sections on clinical practice, research, and publication. The ethics of research imply that the experimenter will be honest, they will take care and protect their subjects, whether their subjects are humans or animals. Psychologists are expected to adhere to a strict set of ethical guidelines. These guidelines involve the following safeguards. The first, and this is very important, is that there is a guideline that says that we have to protect the participants from physical and mental harm. Gone are the days that psychologists could have experiments that might have caused significant and serious mental harm to their subjects. And we'll talk about some of those experiments later on in the course. The second thing is participants have the right to privacy. In other words, when I publish a study, I can't say that Sally Smith did this. I would have to say, participant number 1, 2 did this. So in other words, we need to protect the privacy of anyone who participates in the study. We also have to make sure that the participants understand that the research is completely voluntary. In other words, if you participate in a psychological study and halfway through you decide that this isn't what you want to do, you have absolutely every right to stop. And the last thing is we are required to inform participants about the nature of the procedures before they participate in the experiment. So if you're going to participate in the experiment, the experimenters will tell you up front what they're doing. Now, there are some times that experimenters cannot tell the subject what they're doing or else it would interfere with the results. But those types of studies are scrutinized very thoroughly by ethics committees to make sure that the gain outweighs any potential harm or risk to the participant. All experiments that use humans as participants must be reviewed by an independent panel before being conducted. This includes the minority number of subjects that involve deception. So like I just mentioned, if the study cannot tell the subjects what the purpose is, because if they know what the purpose is, it will alter their behaviors, the ethics committee will look at that study and they'll be very strict with it to make sure that the study has minimal risk of harm to the participants and the results or what we could gain from that study justify the deception. And then after that study, the subjects need to be debriefed and have everything explained to them in full about what happened. One of psychologists' key ethical principles is the informed consent. There are several things that must be revealed to subjects in most situations. So before you start the study, the subjects need to sign a document affirming that they have been told the following things. They've been given the basic outlines of the study. They understand what the study is going to be about. They understand what their participation will involve. For example, if their participation is going to require 3 hours, the informed consent will let them know that this will take 3 hours and it'll explain what they're doing. The informed consent also has to explain if there's any risks whatsoever And we have to notify subjects that their participation is purely voluntary and that they can terminate that at any time. The only time that informed consent and debriefing can be completely eliminated is in experiments when the risks are minimal. For example, if you want to see if people throw away trash that's on the sidewalk, one way to do that would be a naturalistic study, and you could sit on a bench and you could have some trash and there'd be a trash can, and you would watch and count the number of people who walked by and how many people picked up the trash and threw it away. Well, you don't need to let people know that they're in a study when you're doing something like that because the risks are so minimal. They're not changing what they're doing in any way. I mean, the person would have walked by and picked it up or not picked it up despite the study. So in those cases, you don't need to get a informed consent, but almost every other situation, psychologists need to let the subjects know what's going on. So let's take a moment and talk about using animals as subjects. And this topic can be quite controversial. Researchers who use animals in their experiments have their own set of guidelines. And the reason we have these guidelines are to ensure that the animals do not suffer. Researchers must make every effort to minimize discomfort, illness, and pain. Procedures that might involve distress are only permitted when the alternative procedure is unavailable or when the research is justified by its prospective value. And this is not determined by the researcher, this is determined by an ethics committee. There are federal guidelines specifying how animals are to be housed, fed, and maintained, and the researchers must strive to avoid causing physical discomfort. They're also required to promote psychological well-being in some species of research animals, such as primates. Why should animals be used for research in the first place? This picture, by the way, represents a very important behavioral study conducted by Pavlov. You've probably heard about classical conditioning. If you haven't heard the term, you certainly have witnessed it. Anyone who has a cat knows that the cat will come when you start to open a can of food. Or if you have a dog, your dog will get excited when you grab the leash. There's no reason for a cat to respond to the sound of a can opener. That the appliance means nothing to them. But what has happened is the cat has learned to associate the sound of the can opening with their treat. It's the same thing with a dog. They've learned to associate the leash with a walk. So this picture here represents Pavlov's dogs and the original experiment that he conducted. Research with animals has provided psychologists the information that has profoundly benefited humans. For example, psychologists have been able to detect certain eye disorders in children, and they can detect that early enough now to prevent permanent damage. And they were able to find the key to doing this by animal research. We've also been able to learn more about chronic pain and pain management. So using animals has benefited people. Another reason why we use animals is we can have greater experimental control. It's easier to have more control over mice or dogs or something that is right there with you the entire time in the experiment versus humans. Certain conditions could not practically be met due to the dramatic difference in humans. Let's say you wanted to find out what the impact of removing a baby from the mother is. Well, you could not possibly do that with humans. You could not go in and randomly select a group of women and then take their baby. Now, you could do that with primates and with monkeys. I'm not suggesting that I support that. I'm just saying that we could learn a lot of information using animals, doing things that you could not do to people. Another reason why we use animals is it's easier to have a large sample size with animals. Let's say your experiment called for 2,000 participants. It's a lot easier to have an experiment with 2,000 mice versus 2,000 people. And a final reason is animals have a shorter lifespan. And because of that, it makes it much easier to view the entire life cycle. So whether or not you agree with using animals for research, I would like you to know that there are ethical conditions and there's an ethics panel that reviews what we're going to do, and that there are certain reasons why it is more beneficial to use animals versus people. As always, let me know if you have any questions.